Thank you all for braving our shutdown city this morning. So I am Aaron Powell. I am director of Cato's libertarianism.org project, which also published Arnold Kling's Three Languages of Politics. So the last edition of Three Languages of Politics provided an intuitive and powerful way to look at political conversations in this country and the nature of our political divides. But this new edition brings that same clarity and insight into the Trump age. I think really new and valuable analysis for getting a grasp of where we are and what's happening politically in our country right now. So to explore these ideas and their application, I'm honored to introduce Arnold Kling, our author. He's an independent scholar, an adjunct with Cato, a blogger, and author of several books on economics and public policy. In addition to the Three Languages of Politics, he's published Specialization in Trade, a reintroduction to economics with libertarianism.org. And here to discuss the book with Arnold is Russ Roberts. He's the John and Jean Nault Research Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution and host of the brilliant and long-running podcast, EconTalk. So thank you all for coming. With that, I'll turn it over to our guests.
Thank you, Eric. I want to just ask everyone to put their cell phones on airplane mode if you could. If all goes well, this will be an EconTalk episode somewhere down the road. And we're going to talk for about an hour, and then we'll open it up to questions from you. Today is September 23rd, 2019, and my guest is economist and author Arnold Kling. This is his 16th appearance on EconTalk. He was last here in July of 2018 talking about morality, culture, and tribalism. Arnold, welcome back to EconTalk.
Thanks, Russ.
This episode's a bit unusual. We're going to talk about your book, The Three Languages of Politics, which we've already talked about on the program back in June of 2013. But there's a new edition of the book, which is available at Amazon in hardcover, paperback, on a Kindle for a mere $3.99, and it's also available as an ebook, PDF, et cetera, at no charge at libertarianism.org, and we will link to all of those. The other reason, besides this new edition, the reason we're revisiting the three languages is that a lot has happened since 2013. There's plenty to talk about. And I finally want to say that we are recording this in front of a live audience at the Cato Institute. So you guys can applaud now. Thank you. There's about 600 people here, I'd say. I don't know if you could tell from the applause at home. So a quick review. What are the three languages of politics?
Okay, and I'm going to back you up and start back with sort of why I wrote the book, which was I noticed that the expression of political opinions in the traditional media and the social media was not constructive. And the way I put it at the time is people are not trying to express themselves in a way that would change the minds of the other side. They're not trying to open the minds of their own side. They're just trying to close the minds of their own side. And so the big question is, how did this happen? How does this work? How did we end up talking past each other, and then why? And so now I can go to the three languages, which is sort of my explanation of how tactically people manage to talk past each other, sort of dog whistle to their own side and not talk to the other side. So there's a progressive language, a conservative language, and a libertarian language. And each one sets up axes of opposition. So the progressive, it's the oppressor versus the oppressed. So the evil side is people who are on the same side as oppressors, and the good side are people who are fighting for the oppressed. Conservatives put the axis of civilization versus barbarism. So the people who conservatives really feel threatened by, they accuse of getting rid of civilization's restraints and taking us back to barbarism. And for libertarians, it's liberty versus coercion. They see coercion as sort of the ultimate evil, and the state as the sort of the legitimate arm of coercion, and sort of the state is the biggest threat to increase coercion. So you have these three bads: oppression, barbarism, and coercion. We all think they're bad, but each tribe, as it were, thinks it has kind of a monopoly on fighting one particular bad.
And putting all of our cards on the table, I would say, and you publicly say in the book, it's not a secret, that we tend to be more sympathetic to the libertarian axis, the idea that we can organize our thinking around coercion versus freedom. I sometimes tend to look at issues that way, but I have to say that since I read your book, and since I've grown up, which is about the last, I'd say, 4 years or so, recently turned 65, I feel like I've finally grown up. I start to see a lot more merit in the other sides. And you could argue that that is literally a form of maturity, a form of intellectual maturity. Would you agree with that? And would you agree with my characterization of your views, just to get that straight?
Yeah, I think I would describe myself as sort of libertarian/conservative. I have probably the least sympathy on the progressive side, but as you said, there are certain issues, certain things where that voice is correct. And I can think of historical examples where different sides got it wrong. I'd say the civil rights movement circa 1963, 64, when you have libertarians trying to defend states' rights, as Barry Goldwater did, that just seems like they were on the wrong side of that one. The oppressor-oppressed axis probably was a better frame in that case. So, I think it is more mature to sort of be able to be more flexible and be willing to see these various sides.
I want to add that if, for those of you listening and here in person, one of the drawbacks of this book is it takes a lot of the fun out of hating your political opponents. So you might not want to read it. You read it, you should have a warning label. Caution may lead to tolerance of people who don't think the way you do, or may lead to charitable views toward people you disagree with. And I think one of the reasons, let me say two things. First of all, this is one of the most, in terms of bang for the buck, and I don't mean price, I mean in terms of effort and time you have to put in to read the book, it's really an extended essay is how I would describe it. It's not a lengthy tome. In terms of what you get out of it, it's way up there in my list of books that have had the biggest impact on me per word. And the other thing I would add, you can react to both those statements, the other thing I would add is that it's hard to think of a more timely or important book given how hostile people are and intolerant they are of people who disagree with them. So I think this is a book whose time has come. It was prescient in whenever it came out the first time. 2013, when we talked about it. Now I feel like it's more of an imperative.
Yeah, I have sort of mixed feelings about that, in that things are changing so quickly that, I almost feel like this edition is already out of date in some sense. But it's more timely in the sense that I think many more people now are upset at the state of political discourse and wondering, how did this happen? How are we doing this? And the book, between the first edition and the second edition, this is now the third, really explored a lot of sort of political psychology, and there's a lot of that, and we can get into that if you want, sort of the psychology that creates this polarization. And political psychology has just taken off in the last 5 years, and that's a sense in which this book was prescient, was ahead of its time. A term that's really accelerating its usage is called affective polarization. And what that just means, and that's distinct from issue polarization. So issue polarization would be people getting on opposite sides of gun control or abortion or what have you. Affective polarization is just pure love for your own side, and more than that, hatred of the other side. And there's just recently, this psychological phenomenon I didn't even have in the book because I just came across it recently. That suppose you get a little frustrated with the people on your side. Let's say you're a Republican, you don't really like Trump that much. Your psychological response to that is to hate the Democrats more, because that sort of, tones down the cognitive dissonance you feel about being a Republican who doesn't like Trump. So your dislike of leaders on your own side causes you to hate the other side more. That's just one example of the psychology that's involved in creating this polarization and people talking past each other.
Yeah, Adam Smith in the Theory of Moral Sentiments says that I'd like you to like what I like. So if I tell you this is a really great movie and you go see it, I'm going to feel good if you like it, and I'll be disappointed if you don't like it. But if I see what I think is a really awful movie and I tell you how awful it is and you like it, then I'm really upset. So it's more important, Smith claims, and this seems to be an example of effective polarization, it's more important that that our friends hate what we hate rather than that they like what we like.
Well, that's interesting because it's certainly the way people write. I mean, I describe this phenomenon of demonization. So you can think of two extreme types of ways of communicating on issues. You can think of being in a persuasion mode or in a demonization mode. So persuasion, think of a high school debate team where you absolutely don't make any personal criticism of the other team. You focus on the substance and on the logic and so on. And you play by very careful rules. Demonization, think of road rage. All you want to do is let the whole world know that this guy that cut you off is a horrible person. And in politics, demonization means just trying to let the whole world, make sure that the whole world hates the person you hate. And when I think of the examples of people whose opinions are expressed in this demonization terms, listen to a Rush Limbaugh episode any afternoon, and he's trying to make sure that you hate the liberals. Or read any Paul Krugman column, and he's trying to make sure that you understand that you should hate the conservatives. That is, again, part of this, I call this demonization, and that is what characterizes so much political commentary nowadays in regular media and social media.
So I've claimed that, or made the argument that demonization has come out of the expanded choice in our media landscape, that we have an opportunity, unlike, say, a world of 3 television stations that were all very similar, we now have the chance to tailor our choices of media that we consumed and information that we consumed to our tastes. And we're not so interested in the truth, which is, no one likes to be told that. It's an unpleasant piece of information. In fact, when I used to say things like that to people, they don't just go, no, I'm interested too. They yell at you because it hurts their feelings. They don't like to be told that. The idea that media exists to give me what I like in the same way that Amazon does, or Zappos, or a restaurant, and that this profusion of choice has allowed this to happen is, I think, extremely important, because it allows me to have a stream of information that plays to those tastes that you're talking about on both sides. I consume what I like, and I get to hate what I don't like, and my Twitter feed, my Facebook feed, my timeline, my choices of newspaper, et cetera, feed that tribalism.
Yeah, well, I think there's trying to assess, what causal factors have created this sort of apparent increase in demonization is tough. It's my 2 favorite kind of causal things. One of them you just named, the change in the media environment. But you can ask, to what extent is the increase in polarization causing the media environment to change, and to what extent the other way around? The other favorite causal factor would be the sort of cultural sorting that has taken place, where people with different political views, different social classes, different backgrounds, I think used to mix a lot more, and they don't as much, and that can feed polarization, because if you're only around people who agree with you, then there's a high risk in taking the other side's point of view in public among your group, and a very low risk in taking an extreme negative point of view about the other side within your own group. So there's this natural tendency for groups to become more polarized as they become more sorted. But I think it's the whole causal, I would say that the causal model would look like a tangled ball of thread. It'd be very hard to figure out which threads to pull to unravel it. And one counter argument I'll get from people, or people should think about when we talk about the media environment, is look at the 19th century media environment, where it's overtly partisan newspapers or broadsheets or propaganda sheets. And people say, well, politics was never clean. I think my response to that is but we can cite some examples of persuasion, not demonization. I'm sure demonization, you can show cartoons and propaganda sheets and whatever, but I don't think the Federalist Papers would be accused of demonization. I don't think that the Lincoln-Douglas debates were about demonization. So there were at least some very important examples where the discussion was better. But I'm sensitive to somebody saying, look, don't look at 1960 and the political, economic, and media environment in the United States and say that's normal. I mean, it may feel normal to us, we're growing up with that, but I am sensitive to somebody coming and saying, well, that's...
Well, there's no doubt that politics was a blood sport in the 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, 21st century. I think the difference is the role that the consumption of media played in people's... Well, let me say it this way. This is why I would try to salvage my otherwise monocausal explanation. I think the media environment, what people consumed and the role it played in their lives was really different. Most people in 1800 were kind of focused on getting food on the table. Today we have a lot of time on our hands, which is a feature and a bug.
Yeah, the way I describe it, I've always liked a sort of a Marshall McLuhan type look at the media and how they kind of relate to society overall. And one of the distinctions I like to draw is between what I call the sub-Dunbar world, and that refers to the Dunbar number of, you can recognize about 150 faces, 150 close friends, and the super Dunbar world of the larger society. And I think related to what you just said, those were very separate for a long time. I mean, you knew that you lived most of your life in the sub-Dunbar world, among your family, among your work associates, among neighbors, and they were all close to you. You saw them physically, you didn't see them on a screen. And the super Dunbar world was some distant world that was where people were organizing society or they were running large corporations, and that you didn't feel intimate. So there was a clear separation. You didn't feel as intimate with this super Dunbar world. And that has changed with the internet, and it's just progressively changed with smartphones. So you get to the point where your friends exist on a screen. the people that you used to be intimate with now exist on a screen, and then the people that on the screen appear to be intimate to you. So you take a lot more, you feel a lot more sense of ownership of what's going on in public life, and you care about it a lot more. An example of that I've discovered this summer was talking to young people about the issue of free speech. I had this dialogue with a bunch of young people. It was I don't know, maybe a dialogue of the deaf, but I would say, free speech is good. And they say, but there are bad people out there saying bad things. But free speech is good, but there are bad people out there saying bad things. So it's just kind of that back and forth. And I think the difference is that, 30 or 40 years ago, if there were bad people out there saying bad things, they disappeared from view pretty quickly. Classic example, the Nazis who marched in Skokie, Illinois in 1977. That was a big deal in the days leading up to the march. After the march, they were completely forgotten about. Today...
There are about 12 of them.
Yeah, well, but today you get
Those
these...
12 can be really loud today.
And they persist, and they're in your face, and your friends remind you that they were there. So something like Charlottesville, which was another relatively small event numerically, is vivid in people's minds.
Yeah.
And people feel like, I have to do something about it. It's like there's no separate, that isn't part of a separate world that people could forget about most of the time, but where the Nazi march in Skokie, people could forget about very quickly.
I think that sub-Dunbar, super-Dunbar distinction would make a good chapter in edition 4 of your book, 4th edition. I do think there's there's this famous cartoon. Well, it's famous for me. It's probably not famous for most of us, but I probably mentioned it before. I think about it every once in a while. It shows a man at his computer terminal, and he's talking to his wife off panel, outside the panel, and he says, "Honey, I'll be up in a minute. Somebody said something wrong on the internet." And I don't know if you have that problem. I sometimes have that problem. Some person who doesn't understand fill in the blank, economics, trade issues, doesn't matter what it is, has said something that quote, I know is wrong. Now, in the abstract, I know there are millions, maybe billions of people who don't understand that phenomenon out in the real world. Why is it that they've come into my living room in some dimension, into my brain, into my sense of consciousness, because I read it now in my Twitter feed as a response to me on Twitter. And I find that, I'll just say that I think culturally we haven't figured out how to deal with that yet, right? Hayek writes a lot about the difference between the microcosm and the macrocosm, and how the norms that we have for interacting with a small group are different than the extended order of cooperation that we call a market economy. We're pretty good at that. We've gotten better, but we still struggle with that. And he talks about the urge we have in the Fatal Conceit. He talks about the urge we have towards socialism, to extend the socialism of the family, which is a beautiful thing, to the larger macrocosm where it's not so beautiful, tends to lead to tyranny, he argues, and I agree. And I think that struggle is similar to the struggle that you're highlighting here of how I interact with the people in my intimate or casual circle versus strangers versus, I have many friends on the internet who I've never met, right? Who I consider my friends or associates, or I interact with them in various ways online. And the rules for how, not just the norms of how to do that politely, but how I should think about my interaction with them and my standing and connection to them, I think we haven't quite figured out.
Yeah, well, for instance, I wish people would use my terms of service on Facebook, which is no politics at all. I'll share, posts about my travel or dancing or anything. I would put up a cat video before I do anything on politics. And when someone...
A bold statement, Arnold. Frightening, it's shocking.
And, it's just not a medium for that. And when somebody says something wrong or something that really upsets me on Facebook, I just have this rigid rule. don't comment, don't like, don't share. Just, and if somebody, even if they're posting things that I like, but all they're doing is posting politics on Facebook, unfollow. But that's my cultural adaptation. Obviously, that's strange. Why do so many people post political things on Facebook? What do they think they're accomplishing? If you step back and ask, what did you accomplish by doing that? I think the best answer they could probably give is, well, I let off some steam.
Yeah. It's a form of therapy for them. They might argue, but I think you'd agree that it's all looking for the dopamine. I don't have enough followers. I want more followers. So the way I find them is I yell, I rant, I pose, I wave a banner around that says I'm one of these. And the people who disagree with you culturally, who I watch on Twitter, reposting and retweeting and cheering on the uninformative but zealous statement of political belief, I look at them in shock. Yeah, I'm like you. I want to say, what do you think you're doing? And then I think, oh, I know what you're doing. You do too, don't you?
Well, yeah, there are a lot of things, but again, going back to your point that we maybe have not culturally adjusted properly to the technology that's kind of suddenly gotten into our lives, I think is the point.
And we'll have to see how that turns out. I see this book in a way as an attempt to reshape the culture, right? And to think differently about our political disagreements. One of the problems I have with it is I think it appeals to you and me. And most people don't want to learn that other language of their opponents. They don't want to empathize. And so you and I saying, hey, this is how the other side thinks. Now, let me just put a footnote to that. If you have a spouse who's in the other axis, speaking the other language, this is good for your marriage to read this book, because you'll realize, oh yeah, he's not a jerk, she's not an idiot. She just looks at the world differently than I do. And I think that is a clear, practical application. But for most people, they're not so interested in what you're selling. How do you react to that?
That may be true. I think, if I were trying to sum up a prescription of this book, and I don't have this phrase in the book, this is one of these things I keep thinking about, as I go along, and I sometimes come up with better formulations. But I would say my phrase would be, those who know better should do better. So there are a lot of people who are just not going to know any better. They're just going to, see.
Haters going to hate.
Well, but even just they see other people doing it, right? They see this seems to be the way political discourse is conducted, so I'll jump in and do the same thing. So I think anyone who reads this book will know better, right? And but to your point, maybe the people who are drawn to this book probably knew better anyway. So I don't know how, to what extent it brings about change. But that would be my line. It's pretty feeble. Those who know better should do better. And anyway, I'll just leave it at that. Probably come back to some of that later.
I will say, I'm teasing you a little bit about, why would anyone want to follow your insights and learn about them. But I do think for me personally, I don't think I'm normal, but I do think for me personally, it has softened some of my dislike for the ideas of the other side, as well as the people who hold those views. And I think that's a better life. I think it's hard to appreciate the serenity, that's a little strong, but the peace that comes from not hating other people. It's very tempting to hate other people. It's very tempting, and I would argue, Sebastian Junger was on here talking about his book, Tribe. I think that's a profound book. We're tribal. we are tribal. To say, oh, that's a mistake, you shouldn't be tribal, I think that's naive. We are tribal. So what I found your ideas do for me is that they raise the possibility that I can admire, respect the people in the other tribes and even the tribes themselves. And I find myself, I like that feeling. I also like the feeling of hating the other side and looking down on them. I understand the appeal of self-righteousness. It's very deeply in us, and I think partly through that tribalism. But when you can step away from that, and for me it's a little bit like the agnosticism I sometimes advocate on here on EconTalk, that it's good to say I don't know. It's also good to say you might be right, which is really hard for us to say. And so I think your book, for those who have a taste for that, who would like to explore that taste, your book opens up that part of your palate.
Okay.
You want to say anything?
No.
Okay, you just want to applaud? Okay.
Yeah, I'll just. That's part of the problem is sometimes we're a little bit like, twins separated at birth, don't have good arguments.
Yeah, no, that's true. But I would argue that the goal of EconTalk is not to have a good argument, it's to get smarter. So for those of you out there, I hope some of you are getting smarter. One of the things you mentioned in the book, I'm going to come back to this tribalism issue. One of the things you mentioned in the book is, I think it's just a sentence, but it's something that I think about. Religion has organized standard mainstream religion has become less, people are less connected to it. Even over the last decade, rates of church attendance and other forms of religiosity have gone down. So one thought, which you put forward, I don't suggest it, quote, is true, but it is provocative, is the idea that as we have moved away from religion as a source of tribalism, we found other places to express that.
Yeah, and that's a fear that politics is kind of filling that space. I've mentioned that a lot of the political psychology that I've become aware of has kind of emerged since the first edition came out in 2013, and one of the books was by Liliana Mason, who's, I think you
Former
interviewed.
EconTalk guest, yeah. We talked about that book.
She talks about the decline in, the term is cross-cutting identities.
Yeah.
So if you just feel strongly about anything, your religion, your sports team, or whatever, and you find yourself associating with other people who share that point of view or share that emotion, and then it turns out that you disagree with those people on politics, that kind of attenuates your hatred of them. So like if a Trump supporter and a Trump hater happen to show up at a sports bar rooting for the same team in the World Series, maybe that would just make them a little bit less inclined to see each other as inhuman and completely offbeat. And so religion was one of those things that used to do that, where you see, that there, people's politics wasn't perfectly correlated with religion. And that used to matter, but I think people's emotional commitment to their religion is so much less now that I don't think it can even serve that function, even for people who are observant and going to church and synagogue. I feel like the people who go to my synagogue are much more. They're very open-minded religiously. I mean, if you tell them, is there something terribly wrong with Islam? Oh, no, there are good things about Islam. Is there something terribly wrong with Christianity? Oh, no, there are good things about Christianity. Is there something, there's good things about Republicans? Oh, no. They're just much more committed politically than they are religiously, which is...
Yeah, I used to have a hope. I did go through a phase, it was very short-lived, where I thought it might be a good thing for people to do activities that that their in-group doesn't normally do. This would be Republicans going to yoga classes and Democrats going to NASCAR. Though Lillian Mason worried that NASCAR was a dangerous place for African Americans, and I thought that was an interesting example of some of the problem we're talking about, that even the idea of going to a non-political event where you know that people are a certain way, culturally or politically, could be fraught with danger, is, I think, symptomatic of really a huge cultural problem, and it's part of the reason I think people have trouble with patriotism today. It's like, whose country you're talking about, mine or theirs? I like my version of patriotism, but theirs is dangerous. And I think that's really scary. I suggested in a recent EconTalk episode that it hasn't aired yet, it'll be out in a couple of weeks, with Ryan Holiday, riffing on an idea of Marina Abramovich, that it would be interesting to have a physical space where people from opposite ends of the political spectrum, or different ends, in your case it's three, there's at least three, we'll get to the fourth in a minute, but people in different spaces could just sit across from each other in silence and look into the eyes of that person and be aware of their humanity. Yoga might do that. Cheering for a NASCAR or sports team, or going folk dancing, I think could do that. And maybe in response to the appeal of the virtual world, we will find more places in the physical world to do that than we have recently. Maybe that'll help bring us together. In fact, one of the great comforts to me, and it's a terrible comfort, is that when we have a horrible thing happen in the United States, whether it's a mass shooting or a physical disaster, people pull together like, quote, they used to, right? People rescue other human beings without thought of who they are or what they're about. I suggested recently we're not far from where President Reagan was shot, and it was the Washington Hilton. He was rushed to the GW, George Washington University Medical Center, the emergency room. And Reagan makes this joke that was funny at the time. He looked up at he was still somewhat conscious. He looked up at the doctor and said, "I hope you're a Republican." That wouldn't be funny in today's, that's where we are, I think. We're in a world where people just can't handle the political differences, and they don't even experience them. So I do think it would be great if we found social venues and other ways to interact with people who aren't just like us.
And maybe not just interact, but actually have joint projects that they're both are working to do, so that they realize that they're working with each other and they can. That's a real kumbaya theory.
Yeah, well, that's what when you rescue a person from a flood, you don't ask for their voter registration card, I hope. I don't think we do.
Although there was a story, and I think I just put it on my blog, of a tow truck driver who arrives at somebody who needs a tow, and then finds out their politics and drives away without towing them. That's sad.
That's great. Let's talk about the last 5 years. I was going to say the Trump phenomenon. I don't want to call it the Trump phenomenon. I'm going to call it the rise of populism and nationalism, which I think people mistakenly associate with Trump as the cause of it. I think he is more the result. And we look around the world, we see a rise of these phenomena, not just in the United States. And I first saw them as a seemingly fourth axis in use of, or fourth language. What are your thoughts on that? And what do you have to say in the book? I know you write about it as well.
Yeah, I came up with the term in the sort of the Bobo versus anti-Bobo axis. And that Bobo refers to a 20-year-old book by David Brooks called Bobos in Paradise. And Bobo stands for Bohemian Bourgeois. So that's all terminology, but there clearly are, there emerged a lot of resentment of elites in both parties on the part of a lot of people, and this is most strongly evident in, let's say, the contrast between college-educated women and non-college-educated men. So college-educated women now make up a huge portion of the Democratic vote, and non-college educated men make up a large portion of the Republican vote, and Trump, I think, pulled in a lot of non-college educated men who had voted Democratic, even for President Obama, and that was kind of his narrow margin of victory in those states. So that is yet another axis. So there's been a lot of change in the last several years, and the change is ongoing. It's hard. It's if we think of polarization and people talking past each other as a disease, it's like the pathogen keeps mutating. It's hard. It's very hard to even stay on top of.
So I'm going to disagree with you a little bit and defend the first three languages. It's ironic. When I look at Brexit, or when I look at Trump, and I see the issues that I felt, maybe I'm wrong, but that felt viscerally important to their supporters, even though I would not have called Trump a conservative, because he has many policies that were not in 2016 conservative, or at least associated with the conservative wing of the Republican Party. And yet I think a huge part of Trump's appeal and a huge part of the appeal of Brexit is a civilization versus barbarism. And there are many different flavors of that. Some of it's directed toward outsiders, foreigners. Some of it is directed, I think, more toward national identity, the pride of being, say, British, to take it outside the U.S. Example. And so that elite, non-elite, let's stick with England for a minute, obviously a lot of young people voted against Brexit, a lot of older people voted for, obviously the opposite. Young people voted against Brexit, older people were in favor of Brexit, and a lot of that was, to me, a tangled set of emotional issues, not about pocketbook, although it was often brought into the debate, but about what it means to be English, what it means to be related to Brussels, what it means to be part of the world at large. And I think that same thing is going on in America.
Well, let me push back on that particular example. Look at what Brexit has done to the British political system. It's turned it inside out. It split the Labour Party and it split the Conservative Party. So it's clearly done something different than traditional conservatism. And I think Trump does the same thing. I think a lot of traditional conservatives look at Trump's just behavior and conduct and say, this guy is violating guardrails, and guardrails are the essence of social guardrails, social norms, traditions, respect for party elders. He's got no respect at all for party elders and vice versa. He came in with no endorsements from anybody in the party. He came in having been reportedly insulted John McCain, the previous candidate. So he doesn't seem to acknowledge any guardrails. For a traditional conservative, that would be awful, and for some, for this thin sliver of inside the Beltway conservatives, that is, they do become never Trumpers. But it seems that for the people at large, for his populist support, that's a good thing. That it shows that he's not going to go native when he comes to Washington. He's not going to betray us when he comes to Washington. So it becomes a good thing, and so I don't think he fits. I think he really does create a new axis where, for example, a lot of hatred among his supporters is directed against Republicans. They hate Romney. Right. They hate, and so that there's, so I do think that we have to, that he doesn't fit neatly into the civilization, barbarism story. And I don't think the populist movements around the world fit neatly there either. I mean, I'm just trying to think mentally as I go through Italy, France. I don't think the resentment of Macron is a civilization versus barbarism.
So how do you think about without trying to stuff it into a fourth axis, how do you think about this this fear of elites? I do think what has come to the front, or distrust of elites, one of the things that's come to the front is this idea that somehow we've been betrayed, that the people we kind of counted on to, quote, take care of everything have somehow, at best messed up, at worst pursued a policy that for their own benefit. Mm-hmm. And I think both of those, I think that second one is just way over exaggerated, but the first one's true and has been true for a long time, but it clearly has a salience that it didn't have in the past. Yeah. What's going on?
Well, I guess, I keep recommending Martin Gurry's work. His book is The Revolt of the Public. And it's sort of a combination of this sort of media collision phenomenon, or that, the intimate is no longer separate from the larger society. And so people are much more, they treat the elites in the newspapers and in politics as like an immediate family that's betrayed them. So it's just a much more visceral feeling, and they can just be much more aware of it. The example that I like to cite was, maybe people have forgotten, this sort of so-called Rathergate, where Dan Rather at CBS aired this basically hit piece on George Bush allegedly not having done his military service properly, and they included a letter that was written, and somebody on the internet figured out that the letter, which supposedly was written in 1960s, 1970s, used a proportional spaced font that was only available in Microsoft Word, obviously in the 1990s. Well, that kind of expose wouldn't have happened before the new media, and the ability of people to rally around it. I mean, again, I'll go back to, could anyone, even someone like Donald Trump, have gotten along with zero endorsements from the party, no endorsements in the media? I mean, you needed that really up until at least 2008. You needed some base within a party leadership. You needed something within the elites. So the new media environment has definitely empowered people and also made them much more aware of the failings and the perceived failings of elites. So I think it's helped to build this kind of populist move.
I want to focus on that perceived failings for a minute. This sounds, it's hard for me to say because it's an argument I would not have accepted in the past, but is it not possible that the current media landscape, the information landscape, has made it much easier to scapegoat anybody and blame anybody and relentlessly tell people a set of distorted facts or lies that are easy for people to swallow because it feeds that like they have of their tribal identity. When we think of mass movements that are distortive, if we think about, take the Nazis in the 1930s, right? Or the Communist Party during its reign. They had control of the media, either direct control or they got control. And we know that's important. It seems to me that in today's world, no one has control of it, almost by definition, at least right now, in the United States. Maybe in China it's different, here it's different. But that fact that no one has control of it, which usually is a wonderful thing in an economic system because it allows people to tailor their consumption to their preferences, in political space is not so healthy. And it's allowed what is effectively people to believe a set of conspiracy theories about who's running the country and what that's doing to their lives that are simply not true. And yet, I think large swaths of people have come to believe them.
Well, that's true, and they believe sort of equal and opposite conspiracy theories. You know, just the latest one. I mean, this will probably be over in 2 weeks, right? But the Ukraine whistleblower story. I mean, one side sees a conspiracy on the part of Trump and Ukraine, another side sees a conspiracy on the part of media against Trump, and that's.
So here's one of the stranger aspects that I'm not paying attention to that. I don't know about you.
No,
Yeah.
somebody asked me about it, and I said, what is it?
Yeah, I know what it is, sort of, but the reason I'm not paying attention, and I worry sometimes about whether I'm failing my in my role as a citizen, but I couldn't figure out the FBI Russia conspiracy theory on each side, right? So the Trumpers said that the FBI deliberately created a belief that Trump was colluding with Russia. And the anti-Trumpers said that, no, Trump was colluding and they've covered it up, and the Mueller report doesn't exonerate him. It's actually an indictment. He just didn't have the guts, et cetera. And, you know, the amount of effort it would take me as a somewhat educated person to figure out where the, quote, truth lies in that dispute, I give up. That can't be a good thing, right? That actually scares me. And in the old days, we would just there'd be a consensus that what was true and what wasn't. And now you just have to start thinking, you know, you should think, a lot of those probably weren't true. They were just what the media came to as their sort of consensus. And now I'm not sure what to believe about a lot of things.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people just want to tune out because they just don't want to hear the shouting, and that's, I mean, maybe that's good. Maybe that's a healthy response.
Let's talk about, you talk about an interesting term I've been thinking about, the idea underneath it, the state of closure that people have. What do you mean by that?
People want to not have to carry in their minds a sense of ambiguity of things that, well, I'm not sure about. And I think that, you know, that sort of falls under the category of the sort of the psychological reasons why people use these organized things along their three axes. So, you know, if you're trying to, you take something like football players last year, the African-American football players not kneeling during the national anthem. You know, that's something where you could look at a lot of sides and, you know, deal with an ambiguity, but for progressives, if they can simplify it to, okay, well, African Americans are traditionally oppressed, and they're standing up against that oppression, then you've reached closure. You don't have to. It's much simpler to process that. If you're a conservative, you just say, well, the flag and the national anthem, those are symbols of
sacred.
You know, yeah, they're symbols of American greatness, and so trying to tear those down is barbaric. And then again, you've simplified it. Libertarians, I don't know, maybe if you ask two libertarians, you get three opinions. But one thing that they might say is that, you know, what is it with this ritual of saluting the flag and singing the national anthem at the beginning of a football game? That sounds like state worship. You know, it's not just the football players who shouldn't be kneeling. Nobody should be, who shouldn't be standing. Nobody should have to stand, do this state worship. So anyway, that's on that. I'd like to get a little bit more into this sort of the people who know better should do better.
Yeah, go ahead.
My lines on that. I think a couple of the places that just within the last 6 years have gotten worse in that dimension. So my initial read would have been that, you know, someone like Paul Krugman knows better and should do better. I mean, if Paul Krugman walked into an economics seminar, there's just no way he would speak the way he does in his op-ed. I mean, it's just a completely different voice. He's completely compartmentalized his role as a scholar from his role as a public intellectual. But for the public at large, that isn't clear at all. They just see, oh, this Nobel Prize-winning economist just beating up on conservatives. And so there's a case of someone who knows better but won't do better, and he will justify it. I mean, he'll tell you that, oh no, I'm making the world a better place by exposing how awful these conservatives are. But so it's hard to, you're not going to change his mind on that. I think that we had a norm until this administration that the President of the United States was sort of above the political fray. That they might have run a dirty campaign, they might have been nasty, but once they're in office, the Oval Office, they're supposed to be above the fray. Maybe they send their vice president out to be nasty, maybe their campaign commercials are nasty, but it doesn't come directly.
Now they don't want to share it with the vice president. They want to keep it for themselves.
Yeah.
Is there a vice president? Yeah. I think we have one, but it's just got to be the lowest profile vice president of my lifetime.
Yeah.
Somebody's taking up all the oxygen, I think, probably.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
And I'd say the other group that I think knows better but doesn't do better is on college campuses, and in particular, college administrators. I think the most feckless people on earth, but you've got this situation where you have social justice activists who demonize people. I mean, it seems if you'd asked me in the 1960s, where should we head on issues of race and gender, it would be we're treating people entirely as individuals. The whole race-gender thing is transparent. You as an individual take your interests and your capabilities and do the best you can with them, and we'll encourage you, we'll support you, and how that plays out is how that plays out. That's the way it looked like it was heading in the 1960s. Where it looks like it is now, it's team black and team female against team white male. And that seems to justify throwing out on campus every value that used to be sacred for intellectual integrity. So you throw out free speech, you throw out open inquiry, and for purposes of this discussion, you don't model the rhetoric of persuasion, of treating other people with respect, of not making ad hominem arguments, of focusing on facts and logic. So the rhetoric of persuasion has been replaced by the rhetoric of demonization. You allow people to demonize white people in general, you allow people to demonize specific individuals and make them not allowed to speak. And I think that's a case where, again, there are people who know better. There are plenty of, I would say academics of our age, 65 years and older, who came from the left or are still on the left, who understand that. But I fear that's fading. And that to me is even more worrisome than the Trump phenomenon, because there's a pretty good chance that one way or another, the next president will return the Oval Office to being a more dignified and that as a place where people use persuasion rather than demonization. But I think it will take a different temperament of college administrator to say to the social justice activists, look, you can pursue your goals however you want, but we on campus operate in persuasion mode. We don't operate in demonization mode. And that statement is just not being made loudly and clearly enough, as far as I can tell.
So this is fun. I get to take the progressive viewpoint now.
Okay.
So I'm going to say, well, you say that because you're a white male and you've had a privileged life And if you understood how hard it is to be a woman or black, you would understand that there are those norms that you value are actually oppressive. And so I say that, well, let me just add one more piece to that. So that would be the argument on the other side. And well, we're going to react to that. Then I've got another point about colleges I want to add.
I'd say, if you're committed to that point of view, and I don't think you personally are, I think you're probably playing a little bit of devil's advocate.
I've read your book. I understand that that's a legitimate feeling. The question is, should it be carried out in this way?
Yeah, and I think at some point you have to say no. That allowing the discourse to switch from persuasion to demonization is just too high a price to pay. You've got that. You have to. I just think at some point, if I were the college administrator, and clearly I'm not, I could give you all my scorn for college administrators, but I won't.
We've got some of it already.
Yeah,
We're getting the
not
flavor.
enough. Not enough. I'll have to share some with you at lunch or something. But if I were the college administrator, I would just say, look, the intellectual integrity is what matters. They've said for years we can have diversity and inclusion, and we can still maintain our intellectual integrity. In fact, we'll be better for it. Okay, prove that can happen, because I think it's going in the other direction.
So I have a different thought. It seems to me that I wrote an essay where I stole your ideas, but at least I mentioned you, which often doesn't happen. Stole is not the right word, but I riffed on your idea, and I said that the three languages of politics also lead to three blind spots of politics. And I think one of the blind spots, and I went through each group, progressive, liberal, and conservative, progressive, conservative, and libertarian, and I suggested that each of them has trouble seeing something about the virtues of the other side. And in the case of, I think, the progressive axis, I'm not a progressive, so I should just mention the others first. The libertarian axis, libertarians have trouble understanding that freedom isn't good for everybody. We think it is. We think everyone should have the right, and it's going to work out great. And economics in particular, with free markets, everybody's going to grow and prosper. That's literally not true, but we like to. That's our religious blind spot. For conservatives, they think that people who are left behind, that progressives see as oppressed, they think, well, they just need to pick themselves up, without imagining how hard that is if they had grown up in that situation. And so the blind spot I think progressives have is that by seeing people as victims, which of course they often are, they often fail to understand the role of agency and the potential for escaping victimhood and the potential for self-expression, the potential for liberation. And for me, the attitude that colleges have today, that social justice identity politics, I find it unhelpful to the people they're trying to help. And maybe that's just my way of rationalizing it, but that would be my argument.
Yeah, I think in some ways the people it hurts the most are the African Americans and the women who can make it on playing by standard rules, because they're now being told they're inferior, or they're being put in a fishbowl. Like, you're not an individual. You're on team black. You're on team female, and I sort of denied their individuality. So I think that in some ways, I think they're the ones who are hurt the most.
The other thing I would say is that I think universities long ago lost the role that you wish they could play as a place where ideas are shared. I think I'm going to accuse you of romance about what a college campus is. College campus is a place where 18 to 22-year-olds live in luxurious settings, typically exploring some of the pleasures of life while occasionally going to class. This is, listeners know I don't believe in surveys particularly, but for what it's worth, survey results do suggest that people spend much less time on their schoolwork than they used to. I think that's probably consistent with my casual impression of my kids and their college experiences. College is just a place to explore life, and it's a finishing school for mostly rich people, which it's been for a long time, just a smaller sliver. Now it's a bigger slice. And so the fact that there's cesspools of intellectual discourse relative to what they could have been, really not that important. How's that for a depressing thought?
Well, we should close on that note. Yeah, I don't think I can answer that one.
Oh, come on, Arnold. I don't want to close on that note. I want you to fight back. Can't you say anything to make me feel a little bit better about colleges?
We owe these people a chance to ask questions.
Yeah, I suppose. My guest today has been Arnold Kling. Arnold, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Enjoyed it, Russ.
Questions, and please wait till, let's say I have some instructions here for what I'm supposed to tell you. I think you have to wait for the microphone.
Please be sure it's in the form of a question.
Yeah, well, we prefer questions as opposed to speeches, but please wait to be called on. Wait for the microphone so people can hear the question, and announce your name and affiliation if you can share that. Okay, here in the front. Should be rewarded for sitting in the front. People generally tend to leave the first few rows empty, so those who are brave enough should get called on for a while anyway.
Richard Coleman, retired from Customs and Border Protection. As to whether people want the truth or not, you can't handle the truth. We're not built to handle the truth. We're emotional critters. Every purchase we make is, affected by advertising, which is not Consumers Reports data, but what's flashy, what's red, whatever. So my hope, I'm an anti-Trumper, that we escape in 14, 15, 16 months, unscathed, not in a nuclear holocaust, but the next election will put in place people who will have a built-in wall against them. The Trump people aren't going anywhere. The people who get to have the joy of hate aren't going anywhere. The tribalism isn't going anywhere. The underbelly is exposed, isn't going anywhere. And my example is Breitbart. I used to exchange information with somebody on the think tank trail, and they sent me back a Breitbart link. They said, educate yourself. And this was an educated person, and the Breitbart story was about Hillary's child sex ring. And he wasn't kidding. So what's going to change in human nature that's going to, change the arc for our culture?
Well, the part of the conservative outlook is that human nature doesn't change. So it's, that what you need are, social norms and formal institutions to kind of shape people. And I think we're just in a period, we discussed this, in which we don't know what the social norms ought to be on social media. I mean, I have very strict social norms on social media. My blog posts generally show up on average about 10 days after I write them, which means I physically can't react to 99% of the news, because the news just, a story that's big today will disappear in 3 days. It's a way of forcing myself to think ahead, to think long-term, to not use emotional reactions. In the book, I talk about Kahneman's System 1 and System 2, the emotional versus the which is more immediate reaction versus the thinking system. One of the problems with social media is that it really gives you an impetus to react quickly. It rewards you for reacting quickly. I mean, if I tweeted on a 2-week advance schedule, like no one, they would be meaningless. I mean, you have to react to what happened in the last 2 hours, or your tweet, just vanishes into nothing. whatever cultural adaptation to this media environment is an example. But I think, again, I wouldn't count on human nature changing. I, at best, would count on some institutional changes and norms building up, and I'm not promising that's going to happen either.
My only comment is I think you ain't seen nothing yet. I don't think we're going back to normal. Or on the side.
My name is Yahya Al-Shami. I am a Schumpeter Fellow at the Mercatus Center, and I'm a Cato intern here. Essentially my question is, I'll try to put a challenge. It's a question that is, there's an article that was published by the Harvard Review 7 days ago, and it's about how racism and discriminatory speech actually hinders the development of black children. And it produces children that have essentially mental conditions, or it's more difficult for them to, say, cope with violence and so on. So how do we have persuasive conversations about things that actually objectively hinder child development? That's my first question. And the second thing I want to ask, which is a quick question, is could you say more about the project which Dr. Dan Klein told me about? It's called Impossible Conversations. I'm one of his students, so I know it's at least marginally related to this topic.
I guess I'm reluctant to comment on a Harvard Review study that you're summarizing that I haven't read, sorry. It sounds interesting, and I'll have to take a look at it. There are, I think when Charles Murray's and Herrnstein's book, The Bell Curve, came out, I think even on the conservative side, there were people, I think it was Leon Kass, I'll have to look up, who said, this is not a conversation we ought to be having. So there is that argument. I really lean the opposite direction. I think, sort of the answer to free speech is more, or to, alleged hate speech or speech that troubles you is more speech. I think what's difficult is to get someone to understand Murray and Herrnstein on their own terms. People read that and they say, well, all blacks are inferior or whatever, or they want to read Murray and Herrnstein as saying that. If you can't change human nature and people are bound to read that into it, then maybe you do need to police speech. But anyway, that's a delicate issue. Probably it could require a whole another hour of should we have those conversations or not.
Well, let me say something about impossible conversations, which you mentioned. One of my favorite insights of Arnold's was a post he wrote, or an essay, where he said, if you don't like Facebook, which is a big issue right now, I think a lot of people don't like the tech firms and what they've done to our discourse and what they've done with our data and issues of privacy. If you don't like them, make a better one. And there are many, many people right now, really smart people, trying to create alternatives to the current landscape of technology, the current social media landscape in particular. So just to mention two, letter.wiki, which has a conversations contest, won't be out. I think by the time this airs, will have closed. There's a site called Paragraphs, P-A-I-R, Agraphs, where people talk about controversial things with each other. One of the ideas in some of these conversations is that there are no comments, which is sad, but I think one of the problems of conversation now is that it would be weird for you and I to have a conversation and random people could come by and yell at us while we were trying to share ideas or learn about what the other person thought, or just learn something. And I think what's going on now a lot in social media is that that yelling just takes that car off the road and into a ditch of something else, and it's really hard to ignore the trolls. But so one way to deal with this is ignore the trolls. But the second is to create a platform where the rules are set up in advance such that trolling is less likely, hatred's less likely, demonization is less likely. I mentioned two. I know of at least two alternatives to Twitter that people are working on. I know of at least two alternatives to the web and the current browser landscape that people are working on. One based around the blockchain, one, I don't know what it's based on. But there are a lot. Now, the question is, the real issue, I think, is that most people don't care. They just don't care. They're fine with the way things are. They're okay with it. But for those of us who are worried about it, I think it's worth exploring some of these alternatives and trying to use them. It's hard to do. Everybody's on the ones that are out there now. But you build a better one, you will potentially have a chance to win in the marketplace. And the last thing I want to do is regulate in such a way that makes competition harder by building up a fixed cost of compliance that ensconces the current large firms in their markets. So, right there. You. No, sorry. In front of you, yeah. No, right here, yeah.
So I think my question would circle around the last three examples that you were talking about. So you were talking about, on the one hand, Paul Krugman, three hands, right? On one hand, Paul Krugman, and then you talked about Donald Trump, and then you talked about college professors. So I think I would have a question related to maybe some degree of false equivalency, and that one has a much larger megaphone. And so while I agree with the general idea of, an open marketplace of ideas, that one has an almost a unique ability to sway the conversations. And I'd like to think that you're right, that there will be some degree to a return to normalcy, but I'm not sure that I see that that's possible, given the kind of baked in numbers that others have talked about. Is that enough of a question?
Yeah, it's enough. I guess, yeah, and maybe I'm naive, but I think in terms of style and approach and sort of how he got to where he is, I think, Trump is unique. And the other thing here's the thing that might not change, which is the intense, like if you read the Washington Post, then you can't believe that he hasn't been thrown out of office already. I mean, it just, it's the scandal of the day story. And that's also an extreme environment. That's in some ways as extreme as Trump himself. And you know what's going on. Over 90% of the people who are in DC, voted against Trump. So there's no pressure on the Washington Post to be objective at all. So I think we could, in that, for that, from a media environment perspective, I think we could feel like we're in permanent embattlement mode. But I do think the specific office of the presidency, if I were betting, I would bet a more than 50% chance that when Trump is replaced, either a year and a half from now or 5 years from now, that the next president will attempt to not, to deal with the public and his opponents from a persuasion mode and not a demonization mode. That's just my best guess.
Yeah, I'd like to think that's true, but I guess I don't. The question is, do I have any reason for thinking that's true? I took the question to be a little bit different. I took the question to be, some people should be demonized. And I think that's true. And I think that's the challenge that the tolerant, charitable person has to deal with, which is if you're always saying, maybe you're right, and I don't know, there can be a situation, a time in history when that's actually a very inappropriate setting. And I guess I think it was you. You used the word nuclear holocaust, or was that a different speaker?
Was
that was you?
That was
yeah. So sorry, it was our first question. I think it's fascinating to me. I didn't vote for Trump. I think I voted for Gary Johnson. It's interesting that well, never mind. But Trump, I think, is much less likely to lead us to a nuclear holocaust, despite his personality and macho self-image, than many other people who could have held that office. And I think it's hard for us to see that. So the question is that blinding us, those of us who maybe aren't his biggest fans or who despise him, to some of his virtues? And I bend over backwards to think about virtues and positive side effects, but I think there's a risk to that. I concede that. And that's what I took your question to be, and I think it's a legitimate worry. I actually thought you were referring to Paul Krugman, but I think you meant Donald Trump, about the person with the big megaphone. It's interesting to me, I'm making a joke, but I think it's interesting who has the megaphones. There are a few, and the truth is, we live in a time when even a big megaphone isn't what it used to be, except maybe for the presidents. I'll take your point there also. Now, another question. Yeah, back corner.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being here.
Hey.
My name is Julian Kyle Lewis from the American University here in Washington. The New York Times broadcast of the third presidential debate in 2012, where the Republican candidate for president walked onto the stage, put his hand in his pocket, and pulled out his notes for the debate, which the other candidate did not do. And that Republican candidate in the third debate in 2012 got destroyed in front of the entire world decisively. Now, the debate after the fact is whether or not we would like to teach our children to go through life with the notes to guarantee that you'll win, but in the event that you lose, you don't get angry, or is it more the focus of a situation where you have young children who are running for office at their school, and they're using different advantages over kids in the school, and it just gets worse and worse and worse as they're getting older. So what do y'all think about that type of integrity strategy? Just the entire world seeing, this candidate has these notes and this candidate doesn't, and then the candidate that doesn't destroys the one that does, and it's very fair. What do y'all think about that?
I think it would be interesting to look at histories of these televised debates and see, my impression is that, okay, the bet I would make is, let's say, the 1960 Kennedy-Nixon debate. A lot of it would look petty, and you'd like, what were they talking about? Kimwe and Matsu and whatever. But it would look a lot closer to what I call the persuasion mode, to the high school debate team mode, where people are playing by the rules. And then if you then showed a sequence of debates following that, they would kind of get worse and worse. I could be wrong on that, but I think I think I view that as a sign of something that politics hasn't always been as bad as it is now, and I think that's a very tough message for me to get across to young people today. They just assume that politics is what it is. It's this mudball fight. And it's always been that way, always will be that way. And maybe, like you say, maybe I'm romanticizing the way things were, 60, 70 years ago, but I just don't think it was quite that bad.
I don't know. I think people have been demonizing their political opponents for a long time. I'd have to think about why it feels different now. I think it does feel different. I want to react a different way to the question, which is how do you parent in a world where integrity seems to be scarce? And I think it's a big challenge, a really big challenge as a parent. My kids are all in a week and a half, they'll all be 20 or older. And I think I got that right. So my ability to have an impact on their moral foundations is limited. But certainly when they were growing up, I spent a lot of time thinking about what I thought should be the right thing for them to do. And sometimes that meant imitating what they see on television, and most of the time it meant not imitating. And not imitating has its own tribal flavor. We're not like everybody else. It's okay. And I think that's hard for most parents because their kids don't like it. And I just want to encourage people to think about that. I think that's a really important question, whether you, the joke, it's not a joke, it's a line, I think it's only a dead salmon swims with the tide, right? You go and swim against the tide. If you're alive and you're a salmon, you go upriver. And I don't want to oversell contrarianism or nonconformity, but I do think that as a parent and as a human being, we all have to deal with the issue of how much of the cultural space we want to embrace versus stand up against. I think it's an interesting and important issue. Second, yeah. Well, yeah.
Hi, my name is Eva Johnson, and my interest primarily, before knowing anything about you, was the title of this discussion, Three Languages. My background is in language, and listening to you talk about the ways in which we are processing political discourse makes me think of it more as an inability to process or a pathological processing through a singular lens. One side says something and I just can't seem to hear it. And so I was wondering if you've contemplated an approach that applies when you're trying to have an issue-based discussion to the person who is listening to you, regardless of political creed.
So I guess, can you just add a little bit to what you meant by the last sentence? I wasn't sure I caught it.
Have you thought about an approach for issue-based dialogue that focuses on being able to transcend the listener's political creed?
Yeah, I think what we'd probably say that is that there needs to be a will to do that, and that goes back to sort of my maybe I'm romantic about colleges, but I think it takes a lot of effort to learn to distinguish between sort of ad hominem arguments, demonization, and a real issue-based discussion. Anyway, I definitely agree with your point about the language. In the book, I even mentioned that it's sort of like when people are talking politics, it's almost like when a quarterback in a football team is calling an audible and they don't want the other side to hear, to understand. If someone on the left happened to tune in Rush Limbaugh, they literally would not understand what he was saying or trying to say. And I think if a conservative would read Paul Krugman, it's like, you're talking about conservatives. I don't recognize any of these people you're talking about. So the language does divide people. I think the mechanisms for having better discussions, I mean, we can come up with them. I mean, juries are like that. I mean, the one time I sat on a jury, it was very contested. We ended up voting 6-6. But we did not, but between the instructions of the judge and just sort of the somberness of the environment, we didn't call each other names, so we didn't, and we actually changed each other's minds on some things. And so there are settings in which people will deliberate, but they're a lot different than op-ed columns and Facebook posts.
So I'll give a different thought. And nice place to close. I'll praise Arnold for maybe at least the third time. I've learned a lot from Arnold over the years. I think this book is the deepest stuff I've learned from you. And I think in the personal setting, forget this sort of, we've been talking a lot about politics and social media. And let's talk about the dinner table where, language right now is a little bit broken. And, people, it started with the first Thanksgiving of the Trump administration. People were worried going home to their families and could they have a civilized meal together. And for a long, long time, I've held views that were not politically mainstream. Many of you, I'm sure, we're here at the Cato Institute. There's a building now and there's a thing called the Cato Institute, but if you've been, I've been something like a libertarian since maybe 1971, and it's a pretty easy time to be a libertarian. 1971 wasn't so easy. So I've had a lot of really unpleasant arguments for people where I was called horrible things, and I saw it happen to my friends too, and they were scarred by it. I'm sure I was scarred by it. It creates a social face that is difficult to maintain. And what I found helpful about the three languages, and I want to apologize to Arnold, we didn't spend enough time talking about the application of it. You should go back and read the book. You should go back and hear the first interview we did on EconTalk about it, where we go through example after example of how it's incredibly powerful in figuring out what people are going to say. And what it's done for me personally is it allows you to not get angry in a setting where a lot of times there's just two lions roaring at each other. You believe what? And it's the end of civilized interaction. And when you've read this book and you think about the psychology of it, you realize, oh yeah, I remember now that's where he's coming from. He's got that, he's a progressive or she's a conservative or they're libertarian. And it's just so, it's calming. Now, the problem is that you don't have a translator. I'm speaking my language, you're speaking yours. And part of what I think Arnold was saying just now is that it's hard to, sometimes in what you were saying in your question, it's now what? What do we do? I recognize that these different languages. And what I found helpful is it does open the possibility. It's not easy, and this is my romance. It does open the possibility of empathy, of saying, I'm not a progressive, but I understand there are people who are oppressed in the world. I don't think everybody's oppressed. It's kind of like, I'll leave that out. But I understand that there are oppressed people in the world. And now the question is, what should be done about that? All right? That's a good thing to care about. It's a good thing to care about civilization. It's a good thing to care about freedom. And all the things that these three groups care about, we all care about. And we just struggle to see beyond that one that we're really focused on. So if you think about it a little bit more and you talk about it in a thoughtful way, you actually have a chance to have a civil conversation. Not necessarily you're going to convince anybody. Arnold, you're very clear in the book. This is not a guide to how to market your ideas, but it kind of is implicitly. You don't use it, but you could use it that way. But we're just how to treat human beings like human beings. It's a big step forward. I don't think we should minimize how useful that is, just as in a setting where people can't literally speak the same language, we work for ways to find ways to communicate. And I think this kind of taxonomy that Arnold's created gives us a way of doing that. Want to add anything?
Okay.
Let's eat lunch. Second floor.